welcome everyone for joining our CLI seminar today. And our presenter today is Kate Thomson, and then she's visiting us from Faculty of Health Science within the same university, and she spent the last 3 months-ish with us. Her work, from my limited knowledge, is around higher education, and she's particularly interested in how informal conversations can facilitate learning. And then, of course, her research extends on to relationships between early career researchers and more established researchers, and how I guess individuals as early career researchers or as students can learn from more experienced researchers. And also she has a particular interest in translating learning theoretical frameworks and accounts from learning sciences into practice as well, how to guide health sciences practitioners to apply theory into their practice and to inform their practice and become more effective at teaching and acknowledging student learning, etc. And then she's visited Deakin and had done a wonderful presentation there as well. It was highly regarded, and she's got comments that she will probably be sharing with us as well. Without further ado, please join me welcoming Kate for conversation.
Thank you, Lee. It was very generous. Totally unscripted, beautiful. So hi, my name's Kate, as Lee said, and I feel very lucky to have been with CRLI for a little while now, and everyone here is very smart and very generous with their time and their ideas, and so I feel like it's been a really great visit, and so it's nice to kind of put something out there for what I'm hoping is relatively collegial critique, but feel free to tear it apart if that's more your style. I'm also kind of bracing myself for that. As Lynn said, my interest is in informal professional learning, and the place that I work is Faculty of Health Sciences, now the School of Health Sciences, and the group that I'm working within is called Work Integrated Learning. So part of what I'm doing is looking at conversations between colleagues, but also thinking about, in terms of student learning and students on placements in workplaces, how we actually support them to make the most of informal learning opportunities when they're, I guess, at a position sort of in their career stage where they're still struggling with formal learning, how we can kind of make the most of their time. So, yes. So this is pretty much my plan for today's seminar. The idea is to talk a little bit about the research that I build on, as well as introduce some of my research, the ideas around kind of learning through informal conversations, and then think more broadly about the implications of what I've researched for ongoing professional development and professional learning. It's probably an area that I've been thinking about for maybe about 10 years now, so I feel like I'm in a position now to kind of start contributing back to the conversation in a sort of a different way. But before I kind of continue on with that, my guess would be that you probably have some thoughts of your own on informal conversations and how they may or may not support learning. So what I'll do is give you a few minutes to chat to the people around you. Now, in the spirit of thinking about informal learning, relatively recently the University of Sydney Early and Mid-Career Academic Network, SEMCAN, created a competition for early mid-career researchers to communicate our research in a different kind of way. So they were very specific that it couldn't be something academic and scholarly, it had to be a video, a poem, a meme, even a photo. And the idea was to try and make something that would go viral. So the target community and the way you're communicating your research is very different. Now there were 2 awards. There was a judges and a people's choice. Pretty stoked to have won people's choice. So 100% worth losing all credibility and dignity as a researcher, because winning things is always good in a very competitive environment. Just for reference, it's a parody meme. It's based on Drake's Hotline Bling video clip. If you're not familiar with memes, that's kind of important to know and acknowledge. That's how they reference these things in this space. So if you're really struggling to talk to the person next to you, The idea is this might prompt you to think about a different way of learning or a different way of kind of communicating and talking about your research. So I'll probably give you like 5 minutes just to chit chat and then call you back to the group. Okay, so before we go on, is there anything anyone feels like they would like to share based on something that they've heard from someone else or something kind of that occurred to them during the chat? There's no like pressure on you to feel like you have to share something. It's more just if you wanted to. Melanie.
There was a comment over here about formal and informal conversations and establishing patterns and people being on similar wavelengths in terms of things that they are having to achieve and also things that they might be struggling with. And having that conversation might be a way to work through some of the areas that they might be struggling with, and those shared experiences are beneficial to move forward collaboratively.
Okay, so that idea of being on the same wavelength with someone and then sharing something you're struggling with is actually really beneficial to kind of do that together. Okay. Thoughts from this group?
I think in our group, what we find that productive those informal conversations usually are around problems. Specific problems. And our Malaysian guest also said that actually this informal conversation around informal conversation around problems even have a formal structure and it's required by the schools.
It's a nice perspective to think about, like what that means then in terms of learning and how you frame things, whether they're formal or informal. So there's a fair bit of literature around learning more broadly and around professional learning and professional development. In terms of informal learning, it tends to kind of mostly not be the hero. It tends to mostly be kind of a side note or kind of a suggested sort of area rather than a focus of research. So Ero and Billett are probably the biggest names in terms of informal workplace learning and workplace learning generally. I do have some misgivings about Ero's definition of what informal learning is, but I do like the idea that rather than setting up a kind of a false dichotomy, which he's not a fan of, sees it as more of a continuum. So informal's at one end, formal's at one end, and there's kind of a whole lot of learning that's going on in between. He picks up on that idea of something being unintended, a bit opportunistic, that sort of random serendipitous exchange, and unstructured. So setting up something different to a curriculum or kind of a formal program structure where you've got intended learning outcomes and typically very clear activities or assessments that align to those intended outcomes. I think another kind of key contribution in this space is the role of the colleagues that you're working with. So it's not actually about the environment necessarily, it's about the people within that space. And so a key thing that informal learning does is gives you access to colleagues and kind of ideas and things that are beyond your own knowledge really and your own sort of scope of thinking about things. The other thing I kind of sort of seem to pick up on is sort of this time space, so that it's not about something happening at a set time and place, it's every day, it's when you need it, and it's very much situated within your context, so you get to frame the problems and you get to sort of ask the questions. The last point around encouraging conversations and suggesting that academic developers or people who work with professional staff should be facilitating conversations. It's a lovely recommendation, but it sort of just tends to be like you should do it rather than something that we've unpacked is a little bit more kind of meaningful. So there's probably, last time I checked, maybe like 12 people that are worth, for my mind, I guess, reading in terms of looking at informal conversations amongst academic people at universities. And so the other bodies of literature that I drew on then were clinical educators in hospitals, professional staff members in businesses, teachers in schools, because those sorts of groups of people tend to have similar kinds of work and similar kinds of approaches to their work and to their own professional development. So the learning that you kind of get from research in that space tends to be the most relevant to learning about academics informal learning. Key things here are sort of the sorts of things you guys talked about around solving problems together, around surprisingly a lot of emotional support and validation. So that idea that even though you may be the best in the world at what you're doing, you're still freaking out about it a little bit, I think is kind of nice that your colleagues are able to support you through whatever crisis you may be having, and that they can also maybe ask hard questions that you might not ask, but also encourage you to maybe not beat yourself up when you perhaps shouldn't be. So big things are there around trust and privacy, that you can actually admit a flaw or a failing to a colleague and your colleague won't expose you. Very important in a competitive environment. And that idea around colleagues who they actually considered friends, so it's a little bit more than a professional colleague, which I found to be particularly interesting because that term kept coming up in research, and then it also then started to appear in my own research without me kind of, I guess, priming people to come out like that. So as I said, not a lot of people research informal learning, and partly I think it's because it's difficult. So this idea that informal learning is happening is somewhat difficult because it's not necessarily clear what it is, whether it's kind of a process or whether you need sort of a measurable outcome to say, yes, that was informal learning and this is what it looks like. So I think that's part of the issue. And so when I was thinking about how I would conduct research, I chose interviews because for me, while it is very appealing to think about doing kind of an embedded ethnography and sort of stalking people within their own department and, you know, doing that kind of fly on the wall with a video and hiding sort of casually behind hot plants and things like that, that is tempting, don't get me wrong, but I wasn't interested in the conversations that were actually happening. I was interested in people's perceptions of what they were taking away from conversations. So that idea of you've had a chat from a colleague, it's about what you think you've taken away from that, not the actual transcript of a conversation. So methodologically it made sense to use interviews as an approach. And I targeted mid-career academics because they really aren't a focus area of research. People tend to focus on early career academics and the kind of professoriate level and sort of say, you know, how are we developing these leaders and how are we supporting them to mentor, and kind of how are we helping these people navigate a transition into early career after a PhD. And this middle group aren't typically the focus of research, and they're also not typically a focus of professional development programs. So it's sort of in this space where for them, I suspected informal learning might provide a really important opportunity. So that was something that I guess I was hoping for. And then after I'd done some of my research, the way in which they learn and their networks, I guess, of support, research has come out that it is quite different to the early and the late career. So again, it's a sort of a very particular career stage. The questions from the interviews were very broad, sort of things like, can you tell me about the times you talked about your teaching, or what might encourage a conversation about teaching within your department? And so kind of just very, very semi-structured approach. I used grounded theory, so Glaser and Strauss, 1967 version, their constant comparative method. And the reason, again, that was appropriate was around emerging research areas, so places where there's not a lot of research done in that space, for thinking about behaviours within a context, and also for thinking about the participant's experience. So trying to think about what their concern is, what their experience is, and so here we're thinking about the experiences of individual academic staff members. One of my, my main results of the study was to provide evidence of the scope of informal conversations. So typically people have a very limited view of what can be done during or through conversations, and so that idea that in fact academics are using conversations in at least 5 different ways suggests that in fact these are a viable form of continuing professional development. And here the focus is on kind of the value and the role of conversations, so really what they serve to people. I'll go into each of these in a little more detail, but the key here is that there's kind of conversations on their own, thinking about managing, improving, reassuring, preventing and transforming, and then the idea of conversations linking to more formal opportunities for development so that they can complement formal learning or obviously conflict with or completely be disconnected from, is important to think about in terms of people trying to synthesise their learning and actually take it away and then apply it in practice. The vast majority of conversations were about managing teaching context. So about 82 of 169 incidents within the data were about managing their teaching. So that is the overwhelming sort of focus of academics. It's really that kind of survival mode, going all the way through to about 9% for transforming, so a very small percentage compared to sort of, you know, what is essentially almost half. So this idea of talking to manage or survive your teaching context is around practicalities of day-to-day teaching. It's literally, I need to get this job done by a particular time with a minimum standard of quality achieved, where things are, who do I talk to, how do I get through. So this is kind of, I guess, what people might imagine when you think about that corridor conversation or that kitchen conversation on the fly. You know, oh my God, that problem I have, that person will know the answer. Quick, get it done, solve it. The idea of improving is probably sort of one step up from that. So that tends to be around improving your teaching, but also thinking a little bit more broadly around your students' learning. And so thinking about something that's perhaps worked in your colleagues' practice, or something that you're suggesting for someone else. So sort of gentle improvements. You know, maybe emphasise this bit a little bit more, or spend a bit of time on that. There also seems to be a sense of exchanging resources, so readings, frameworks, things that, based on your understanding of a colleague's context, or what you think a colleague would be really good at, kind of just a very simple improvement, something that's achievable within a given time frame, and something that you or they would recommend as relevant. So this was an interesting space. So I would argue that that idea of emotional support or reassurance, some kind of validation, is typically not found in formal professional development, and typically not found in formal meetings or more structured opportunities for learning, shall we say. And it's not that it necessarily should be there, but I guess this is at least one way that conversations can complement other formal sorts of communication about teaching. Key here is that, you know, you're doing the right thing, or as Patrick described it, you're not doing a terrible job. So he's not going to, like, these are academics, right? We're not going to tell you you're excellent or exceptional when you're not. We're just going to tell you at least you're not terrible, because that's believable, and that's all you want to know, that you're just not terrible. And that maybe, you know, it didn't work out, but you made the right decision given the difficult circumstances. It's not entirely your fault that everything fell apart. So this, I think, is really, really nice or really sad, depending on your perspective. Talking to Vent about teaching-related issues, I think, is, again, something that's not seen elsewhere. And so there's no set agenda unlike a meeting. So whatever seems to be...
Angry ranting.
Angry ranting, that's right. Angry ranting, whinging. There was a lot of, my sample involved some Australian academics, and so there was a lot of Australian terms used in when they described the nature of these conversations. Whinging is apparently something that not everyone uses as a term. So just that idea of grumbling and moaning, and almost a cathartic release. So rather than letting that kind of problem or issue become part of your ongoing saga, it's very much a release and move on. So you've kind of vented, done, next. The reality is you need to get on with things, so you're not sort of dwelling and focusing on your problems. And here, this idea of transforming your thinking and practice of teaching. So this was a little bit different because we had people who had sort of established relationships or had been around for a long time. It was somewhat more of a coordinated developmental long-term approach rather than that sort of improving very, very simple, very short-term. This was more about not a specific aspect of the teaching, but perhaps across a course or across a year. And so the people that talked about this kind of had a different view, I guess, around teaching and how it might develop and change. And so they saw conversations as really key to, I guess, maintaining and also creating that sort of culture of ongoing change and ongoing improvement at a little bit of a different level. And so the next kind of thing that I'm still playing around with a little bit is that idea of academic colleagues in this particular context have a high degree of assumed shared knowledge. So the people that people are talking to are actually very similar to themselves. So they're often people within your department. They may have taught similar courses to you. They may have a similar student group to you, or they may have the students that you taught last year, or you may have their students from last year or something like that. And so what you have is that, and also this idea around you determining what you think is relevant for your learning. So based on your focus and what you want to change about your teaching or not change, who will know what you don't know, but that you think you need to know. So because I guess academics are responsible for their own learning in this way, the way in which they seek colleagues out I found particularly interesting because they're trying to find people that meet basically two minimum criteria, right? So they're unlikely to turn you away or expose you for needing help. So there's a minimal risk there. That's really important because you don't want someone to tell you no, go away, or to actually dog on you as failing, because these are not good things, right? And the other key point is that they will offer you something useful. So typically very quickly, because neither of you have any time, and you certainly don't have any time for your teaching because you've got to get on being busy researchers, you're academics after all. So there's that other weird element of risk there. And if they don't know something, they'll probably try, or they'll refer you on to someone else, again based on their understanding of your problem and your understanding of your problem. So this idea, if they don't know the answer, they'll be able to kind of refer you on to someone else. So that leads me to think about kind of at least three groups of people who are potentially useful, and I would suggest there's probably a fourth group of people who are perhaps neighbours that are close but not necessarily the ones that you want to hang out with. So there's probably a bubble there that you may approach once, possibly twice, and then you may never seek a conversation with them again. And there may be others as well who are perhaps not as invested in you or your teaching as you might wish them to be. So this idea of kind of being very close to someone but also being very familiar with them, so that sort of proximity, familiarity combination tends to be very important with this social kind of learning. And so when I started to unpack this idea of commonality and what I'm calling here camaraderie, it does appear in other literature. So in sociology, it sort of appears as homophily, so that idea of birds of a feather flock together, that's what that kind of thing is. In social psychology, it's this sort of thing called propinquity, and it's probably been around since the 30s at least, whereas homophily is maybe around the 1970s that kind of emerged. And then in linguistics, sort of you get this idea of common ground. So within even the structure of a conversation, as you have a conversation with someone, you build more and more common ground. So it becomes easier to then continue to build on that. So it starts to sort of perpetuate itself in a way. And The other thing about this learning here is that it's very much intentional on the part of the academic, and it's relational. So the process here is that as a conversation progresses, the informal learning that's happening is something that you're in charge of on one level, but also the person that you're speaking to takes sort of responsibility for that too. So what I'm trying to figure out here is the bits and pieces where you kind of are stuck with people, sort of what your neighbours are. So they're perhaps less likely to turn you away because there's a good chance one day that they will need you. Your friends are the people who you've got a bit of a history with, so you may no longer work with them, but you've got a pre-existing connection. You know them, they're a bit of a sure thing. And again, that kind of idea of knowing someone speeds up the efficiency of the conversation. So what you get here is sort of autonomy is a big driver because that's sort of your own learning as an academic, but you can't take up too much time of someone else's. So if you want to fritter your time away and stay up all day or night, fine, whatever, but you don't want to be wasting other people's time. So you need to be very efficient in what you're asking and then who you're also asking questions of, so you don't have a long time explaining things. And sort of where they overlap is what I'm calling comrades, because I think a key part of all of this is that we're in I would say a highly competitive environment, and often in a research-intensive university, it can be very difficult to invest time in your teaching. It's sometimes perceived as not a strategic use of your time. So having people that are kind of with you in the shared sense that teaching is a worthwhile investment is really important. So that's why I've kind of gone with the comrades sort of term there. And to create these kinds of people, I guess I'm starting to think about more opportunities for shared work and shared responsibility, and that idea of investing in colleagues who invest in you is sort of a nicer, I guess, model than a hardcore competition model. And then I'm kind of in this space now thinking about what's the next steps and kind of what's the implications. So if I'm going to research an area, where am I going to research, and what are the sorts of issues that this starts to bring up? So I guess I'm thinking about if you were focused exclusively on surviving your teaching, does that limit the scope for improvement? Rather than thinking about how can I transform my teaching, or do I even have time to do it, it's literally just getting the job done. And if we let people kind of focus on autonomous learning and think about being efficient with your learning rather than perhaps what might be thought of as more innovative learning, does that actually limit it, and does people's networks limit their potential for learning as well? And then the next thing to think about is, if we say, okay, great, let's assume that this is kind of worth pursuing and conversations are a valid and important and meaningful way of learning. If we start to encourage people to have a conversation with a colleague, and we perhaps not formalise it, perhaps we mandate it in some way, do we start to lose the benefits that come from autonomy? Do we start to lose the benefits that come from serendipity, where things aren't mandated? And is there a way to actually maybe design for informal learning without losing those things that might actually make it worthwhile? So that's sort of where my headspace is at the moment. And very happy for anyone to offer thoughts on these, because that would be lovely and make my life incredibly easy, or add more questions, because there are plenty. Otherwise, I'm done. Thank you.